Memphis, late 1956. America had never seen anything like him. Elvis Presley, just 21, with a voice that could melt steel and a swagger that electrified teenagers, had exploded from local boy to national sensation in a matter of months. His records blared from every diner jukebox. His name filled every magazine. For the young, he was freedom in human form. For the old, he was a storm they could not control. And then came the blow. From Jacksonville, Florida, a stern judge thundered that Presley was a disgrace to the nation, demanding his concerts be stopped, his movements branded indecent. Within days, headlines carried the accusation across the country. Is Elvis corrupting America's youth? Preachers fumed, parents panicked, politicians muttered about bans. Overnight, the boy who had just become a star found himself painted as the enemy of morality. One moment he was the hope of a generation. The next, he was on trial in the court of public opinion. The question that burned in every mind was simple. Would Elvis bow his head and tame the fire? Or would he risk everything to face down the system determined to silence him? Let us know where you're watching from. And we hope you enjoy the story. The courthouse wasn't built for spectacle, but that morning it felt like a theater. Ceiling fans spun lazily above rows of polished wooden benches, yet the air inside was heavy, almost feverish. Outside, the Florida heat pressed on the city like a hand determined to smother every sound. Reporters had gathered on the courthouse steps at dawn, pencils sharpened, cameras loaded, waiting for their story. They already knew it would sell. Elvis Presley, 21 years old, hair slicked high, sideburns too long for polite society, had been summoned here. His crime was not theft, nor assault, nor any recognizable offense of law. It was his body. Or more precisely, the way he moved it when music took hold. Judge Marion Gooding, stern and unsmiling, presided at the bench. He had a reputation in Jacksonville as a defender of tradition, a man who believed America's moral spine was under siege by television, comics, and now, most dangerously, rock and roll. In his chambers earlier that morning, he'd spoken bluntly to colleagues. If this boy is not stopped, our daughters will belong to chaos. The arrest warrant wasn't formal, not yet, but Gooding had summoned Presley in front of officials and local clergy to deliver a warning that felt more like an indictment. Your movements on stage, the judge declared, his voice echoing against marble walls, are indecent. They corrupt our youth. If you persist, you will be subject to arrest under the statutes of public morality. The words struck like stones in still water. Every reporter scribbled furiously. Some smirked, already imagining tomorrow's headlines. Elvis Presley, accused of indecency in Jacksonville. Others glanced at the young man himself, expecting defiance. But Elvis did not raise his voice. He sat quietly, his hands folded, eyes steady but restless, as though he were listening to a sermon in church he did not believe in. He had grown up in Pentecostal gatherings where preachers shouted about fire and damnation. The judge's tone felt eerily familiar. Yet this wasn't the language of salvation. It was accusation, dressed in robes. Outside the courthouse, the split in America was visible. On one side of the street stood older men and women clutching signs. Protect our children. Rock and roll equals ruin. Many had been stirred by sermons in their churches, where ministers thundered against the devil's music. On the other side, teenagers pressed forward, girls in bobby socks and boys in rolled-up sleeves. They chanted his name, shrill voices cracking with devotion. The irony was impossible to ignore. A generation terrified of losing control, another desperate to find it. That evening, the local newspaper carried Gooding's statement verbatim, warning that Presley's performance bordered on lewd exhibition. The article described him as a menace with wild gyrations unfit for public view. Across town, another paper ran the opposite take, calling him the voice of youth, daring to be free. Within 24 hours, the story had spread to New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. Headlines split neatly into two camps, public menace versus cultural hero. For Elvis, the weight of it sank in as he sat in his hotel room with Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, pacing the carpet with a cigar clamped between his teeth. Parker wasn't troubled by morality or principle, only profit. "Kid," he muttered, "this is the best advertisement we could ask for. They're doing our work for us." But for Presley, it wasn't that simple. He felt the pull of something larger than ticket sales. His whole childhood in Tupelo, in the shotgun shack where poverty hummed through the walls, had taught him the meaning of humiliation. Now, to be called indecent by a judge, paraded as a threat to his own country, it stung deeper than Parker's reassurances could reach. The tension grew sharper when word arrived. The Jacksonville police had been instructed to attend his upcoming show. Not in plain clothes, but in uniform. Their orders were clear. If Presley made a single, provocative movement of the hips, he was to be arrested on stage before thousands of screaming fans. The warning was delivered quietly, but its echo filled every corner of his hotel room. The prospect of handcuffs in front of a crowd wasn't just humiliating, it could end his career before it had properly begun. Still, beneath the anxiety, there was a flicker of something else. Not rebellion exactly, but resolve. Elvis understood, in a way that surprised even him, that the battle was not about the tilt of his hips or the twitch of his legs. It was about permission. Who had the right to define what music, what joy, what freedom looked like? On the streets of Jacksonville, the night before the concert, boys scrawled his name in chalk on sidewalks. Girls swapped stories about his latest record as though it were a secret code. Parents fretted behind curtains, convinced disaster was coming. The city felt balanced on a knife's edge, every heart waiting to see if a single young man could topple the weight of law with nothing but a song and a smile. And somewhere, in the dim hotel light, Elvis Presley stared at his reflection in the mirror, comb in hand, thinking not of glory, but of survival. Tomorrow night, every eye in Jacksonville, every eye in America, would be watching to see if he dared to move. The Florida Theater in Jacksonville had never looked so fortified. Outside, patrol cars lined the street bumper to bumper, their flashing lights painting the humid night air in red and blue. Uniformed officers clustered at the entrance, scanning the gathering crowd with suspicion usually reserved for riots. Yet this wasn't a mob in protest. It was teenagers clutching ticket stubs, laughing nervously, brushing each other's shoulders as if heading into a secret revolution. Inside, the atmosphere was fevered long before the curtain lifted. The ornate plaster ceiling and velvet seats could hardly contain the noise of hundreds of restless voices. Girls shrieked whenever the house lights flickered, convinced that meant he was about to appear. Boys leaned forward, pretending to scoff, but betraying admiration in the way their knees jiggled with anticipation. Then there were the police, dozens of them, stationed in the aisles and at the edge of the stage, caps low, eyes alert. They weren't hiding their orders. The word had already spread through the audience. If Elvis Presley dared to swivel his hips, dared to let rhythm move through him the way it always did, he would be seized right there before their eyes. Some kids whispered the rumor like a dare. Others clutched each other's hands, terrified that their hero might be dragged away. Behind the curtain, Elvis stood in the shadows, guitar strap slung over his shoulder, fingers tapping against the polished wood. His body was restless, not from the usual pre-show nerves, but from the weight of a decision he hadn't fully made. Colonel Parker paced beside him, cigar smoke curling in the dim backstage light. "Play it safe, son," Parker said, half command, half plea. "Give 'em the music, none of the trouble. They'll scream anyway." But Elvis knew that wasn't true. His audience didn't scream just for the songs. They screamed because the music seemed to set him on fire, and his body, unashamed, carried the blaze outward. To stand still would be to betray not just himself, but every kid in the seats who had come to see something the adults told them they shouldn't. The stage manager gave the signal. The lights dimmed. A wave of noise roared through the theater, shaking the plaster like thunder. He walked out slowly, guitar gleaming, suit pressed sharp. The sound hit him like a physical force, hundreds of voices rising, shrieking his name, drowning out the cautious coughs of the officers stationed below. He strummed the opening chords, his voice steady as he sang. But his eyes kept darting to the edges of the stage where the law stood waiting. The first verse finished, and instinct told him to move. His body tensed, the familiar pulse of rhythm begging to travel down his spine to his hips. He could almost feel the cold grip of handcuffs already. For a breathless moment, the crowd seemed to hold still, expecting defiance. Then Elvis did something no one anticipated. He didn't move his hips at all. Instead, he lifted his right hand, extended one finger, and gave a slow, deliberate wiggle. The girls in the front rows erupted, shrieking as though the gesture had set the room ablaze. A grin spread across his face. He pointed the finger again, curled it, wagged it side to side with mock seriousness. The laughter and screams doubled, bouncing off the ornate walls. Behind him, his band struggled not to laugh as they followed his lead. The officers shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. This was not the indecency they had been told to police. He was mocking them, and they knew it. But there was nothing to grab hold of, no violation to justify storming the stage. Elvis leaned into the game. Instead of hips, he threw in exaggerated shoulder shrugs, rolling them like a parody of his usual moves. He winked broadly at the crowd, blew kisses, snapped his fingers like he was conducting them instead of singing. Every time he made the smallest gesture, the screams intensified, rising to a pitch so high it drowned out rational thought. The tension in the room shifted. What had begun as fear that their idol might be shackled before them, transformed into electricity. They weren't just watching a concert. They were witnessing a duel between youth and authority, freedom and control, humor and fear. And their champion was winning without even breaking a law. At one point, Elvis crouched low, eyes blazing with mischief, and raised his guitar neck like a rifle, aiming it at the policemen lined along the aisle. The crowd shrieked as though he had fired. He strummed a quick lick, sharp and defiant, and the girls near the stage nearly fainted. Every movement became more charged than the scandalous hip thrusts ever had been. The finger waggle, the exaggerated shoulder roll, the sly grin, each was an act of rebellion, made powerful precisely because it denied the officers the chance to act. By the final song, the theater was a storm. Fans screamed themselves hoarse, standing on chairs, clapping wildly in rhythm. Even the walls seemed to tremble under the weight of it. And there, standing center stage, Elvis felt the strangest mix of fear and triumph. He had faced the threat of arrest, the glare of authority, and somehow found a way to turn it into laughter and ecstasy. When the last chord faded and the curtain dropped, he staggered off stage, drenched in sweat, heart pounding as though he had run miles. Parker grabbed his arm, shaking his head in disbelief. "You crazy son," he muttered, half proud, half furious. "You made fools of them all." Elvis leaned against the wall, chest heaving, eyes blazing. "No," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I just showed them they can't tell me how to feel music." Out in the theater, as the crowd spilled into the humid night, the stories had already begun to form. Some whispered that he had outsmarted the law, the Baediki. Others swore he had been funnier, wilder, more alive than ever before. The police filed out in silence, their mission unfinished, their authority dented by a boy with nothing more than a guitar and a mischievous grin. And in every newspaper office, from Jacksonville to New York, telephones rang with the same report. The concert had not been stopped. The singer had not been arrested. And somehow the night had become more scandalous than if he had broken every rule in the book. The judge who had set the trap would soon discover the cruelest irony, that his attempt to humiliate Presley had only deepened the legend. Morning broke in Jacksonville with the smell of ink and the clatter of printing presses. Across the city, boys on bicycles hurled newspapers onto porches, and with them came the newest battle lines of America. "Presley Mocks Justice," blared one headline, claiming the young singer had insulted the court and made a spectacle of law enforcement. Another paper countered with equal boldness, "Genius outwits censors, crowd in frenzy." Some described his finger waggle as a childish mockery of authority, while others painted it as a stroke of brilliance. By noon, the story had spilled far beyond Florida. In New York, Chicago, even London, columnists debated whether Elvis Presley was a menace or a pioneer. For every furious preacher condemning him from the pulpit, there was a college student scribbling his name in notebooks like a secret password. The irony was merciless. What Judge Gooding had hoped would extinguish a rising flame had, in fact, turned it into a wildfire. Within days, ticket sales for Presley's upcoming shows soared. Promoters who had worried about cancellations now bragged about sellouts. Record shops couldn't keep his singles in stock. Mothers who had banned their daughters from seeing him discovered the girls sneaking out, pooling coins for tickets as if planning an escape. Yet for every teenager who felt liberated, there was an adult who felt cornered. Church bulletins thundered with warnings about jungle rhythms. In small towns, pastors urged parents to burn his records. Outside a radio station in Texas, protesters waved placards painted in black letters, "Stop Elvis now." A few stations complied, quietly pulling his songs from playlists, fearing boycotts. But just as many doubled down, broadcasting his voice more frequently, knowing controversy drew listeners. Elvis himself, riding the wave from one town to another, lived in a strange twilight. Hotel lobbies were packed with screaming fans, yet the corridors hummed with hostility, letters arriving daily, some dripping with venom. One envelope contained only a Bible verse scrawled in red ink, warning him of eternal fire. Another, written by a group calling themselves Mothers Against Indecency, demanded he retire or face the wrath of God. Then came a letter that stopped him cold. It was addressed in neat handwriting, postmarked from Mississippi. Inside was a short note from a woman who introduced herself simply as the mother of a boy who heard you sing last week. Her words were plain but piercing. "You gave my son a reason to look forward again. He has been sick for months, quiet as a shadow in this house. After your concert, he told me he wanted to live, wanted to grow, wanted to fight to stay here with me. I don't know what you call that, but I call it hope. Please don't stop." Elvis sat on the edge of the hotel bed, reading those lines again and again. as if trying to memorize them. Around him, the room carried the stale smell of cigars from Parker's constant smoking, the half-eaten tray of room service, the muffled voices of reporters waiting outside. None of it reached him. The letter did. It cut through the noise louder than any headline, clearer than any sermon. He folded the paper carefully, slid it into his wallet, and carried it like a talisman. For the rest of the tour, he would pull it out in quiet moments, on the bus, backstage, alone in a dressing room, and let the words remind him that the fight was not about whether he swayed his hips, but about something deeper. Meanwhile, the storm intensified. Politicians began to sniff opportunity in the uproar. A state senator from Georgia announced he would push for legislation banning lewd exhibitions in public halls. A congressman in Washington declared Presley a dangerous influence on national character. Yet these condemnations only seemed to fuel curiosity. Teenagers, who had never cared about legislation before, now spoke of Elvis as though he were their secret candidate for freedom. In one city, a local sheriff attempted to cancel a scheduled performance, citing fears of disorder. Tickets had already sold out. The cancellation only heightened the frenzy. Scalpers doubled prices, and teenagers wrote petitions. When Elvis finally did appear, the roar of welcome was so intense it drowned out the orchestra's opening notes. What none of the critics understood was that every word of hatred became free advertising. The more they denounced him, the more the public leaned in, eager to see what the fuss was about. For every sermon condemning him, 2 more kids slipped coins into jukeboxes to hear his voice. For every poster screaming, "Stop Elvis," another bedroom wall was covered in his photographs. And through it all, Presley himself wrestled with contradiction. Part of him recoiled at the venom, the scorn, the threats of arrest. Yet another part, stronger now, recognized that something larger than his career was taking shape. He wasn't just a singer anymore. He was a mirror reflecting the country's divide. Every cheer and every curse revealed who people were and what they feared. Late one night, rolling between cities on the tour bus, he leaned his head against the window and watched the dark countryside slip past. The letter from the Mississippi mother was in his pocket. He thought about her boy, about the pastors calling him Satan, about the judge who had stood in his black robe and declared him indecent. He realized then that his mission was no longer about approval. It was about endurance. If hatred could be turned into fuel, he would burn brighter. If laughter could disarm the law, he would wield it like a weapon. And if even one life found hope in his music, then no courtroom in America could silence him. The paradox was complete. The very attempt to shame him had carved his place deeper into the heart of a generation. Judge Gooding had wanted to make an example of Elvis Presley. He had, but not in the way he imagined. New York, 1957. The city never slept, but television studios at dawn were especially restless. Delivery trucks rattled down West 53rd Street. Stagehands smoked in the alley, and the smell of hot cables and dust lingered behind the curtain. On this particular morning, the tension inside Studio 50 was unbearable. Elvis Presley was about to perform live on The Ed Sullivan Show, but there was a catch, one that weighed on everyone present. After the uproar in Jacksonville, after weeks of headlines declaring him a menace to morality, CBS executives had drawn a hard line. Presley was to be filmed only from the waist up. No gyrations, no full-body shots, no scandalous movements that might send viewers or sponsors into panic. For a singer who lived in motion, it felt like a straitjacket. Backstage, Elvis leaned against a makeup table, dressed in a dark jacket and tie that barely concealed his unease. The mirror reflected not just his face, but the dozen crewmen whispering about the restrictions. One cracked a joke. "Guess America can't handle below the belt." But the laugh died quickly. The tension was too real. Colonel Tom Parker strolled in, fanning himself with a folded program. "Don't fuss about it," he muttered, ever practical. "They cut you in half, so what? Millions will still be watching, and millions make money. That's all that counts." But for Elvis, it wasn't that simple. He thought of his fans, kids in small towns who had written him letters describing how his music made them feel alive for the first time. Could the camera deny them the very thing that had drawn them close? In the hallway outside his dressing room, he could hear the audience filing in. Girls giggled, heels clicked on tile, ushers shouted instructions. Somewhere down the corridor, Ed Sullivan himself rehearsed his opening lines. The host had once dismissed Presley as unfit for television, yet the ratings war had forced his hand. Now Sullivan needed Elvis as much as Elvis needed the stage. When the cameras finally blinked on, the room fell silent. The red light glowed. The band struck its first chord. And there he was, framed tightly from chest to crown, his face filling the nation's screens. Something unexpected happened. Instead of diminishing him, the limitation magnified him. The camera lingered on his eyes, catching every flicker of mischief. It captured the curl of his lip, the sweat forming at his temple, the flash of teeth as he smiled. Girls across America sat glued to living room sets, screaming at an image that offered no escape, no distraction, just his face, alive with intensity. Even the stillness of his body became a kind of weapon. Where the audience expected wild hips, he gave them a defiant stare. Where they anticipated scandal, he delivered a smirk so loaded it said more than 1,000 gyrations ever could. Behind the glass in the control room, CBS executives exchanged nervous looks. They had tried to neuter him, to reduce him to a safe upper-body broadcast. Instead, they had stumbled into the most magnetic close-up television had ever produced. The phone rang off the hook as sponsors clamored not to distance themselves, but to buy more time. Ed Sullivan, a man not prone to exaggeration, walked on stage after the final song and declared to America that Elvis Presley was a fine young man. The words shocked those who remembered his earlier contempt, but the numbers left no choice. The show broke ratings records, drawing more than 60 million viewers, an audience larger than the population of many countries. Backstage, the celebration was complicated. Parker puffed triumphantly on a cigar, already thinking of merchandise and tour routes. Musicians laughed with relief, knowing the performance had landed without scandal. But Elvis sat quietly, shoulders tense, his guitar resting across his lap. He felt the victory. Yes, the roar of the crowd, the surge of approval. But beneath it, he also felt the sting of control. They had muzzled him, framed him, dictated how he should appear. He had won the night by turning their restriction into theater. But at what cost? Was he free, or was he a puppet cleverly dancing inside invisible strings? As he left the studio, a swarm of reporters pressed forward, shouting questions. "Elvis, did it bother you they filmed you only from the waist up?" one asked. He hesitated, then smiled that practiced smile and deflected, "Well, I reckon folks heard the music just fine." Cameras flashed, fans screamed, and the night carried him into history. Yet later, alone in the quiet of his hotel suite, the truth weighed heavy. He stared out at the Manhattan skyline, lights blinking across the river, and thought of the Pentecostal church services of his boyhood. There, music had meant freedom, release. the spirit moving through flesh. Here, in the heart of the nation's media capital, the same spirit was caged inside a rectangle of glass. Still, the irony was undeniable. The more they tried to contain him, the larger he grew. Each restriction turned into fuel. Each attempt to diminish him made him impossible to ignore. The system that feared him was, without meaning to, building his legend brick by brick. And in that paradox, Elvis felt both triumph and unease. He had learned an essential truth about fame. Sometimes the bars of a cage are the very things that make a lion unforgettable. The weeks after the Sullivan broadcast turned into a flood of paper. Bags of mail arrived at RCA's offices in New York, truckloads delivered to Graceland, and sacks stacked so high in hotel lobbies that bellboys groaned under the weight. America had discovered a new pastime, writing directly to Elvis Presley. The letters were a map of a divided country. Some began with trembling affection. "Dearest Elvis, I cried when you sang last Sunday." Others dripped venom. "You are filth. You are the devil's pawn." Handwriting varied from teenage curls decorated with hearts to furious block capitals etched so hard the pen nearly tore the paper. Colonel Parker loved the spectacle. He instructed secretaries to photograph the piles, turning them into publicity stills. "Look at this," he'd boast to journalists. "One boy from Mississippi and the world can't stop talking to him." But to Elvis, the letters were not props. They were voices he could hear late at night, louder than applause, harsher than headlines. One envelope, postmarked from Texas, came from a Baptist minister. The language inside was merciless. "You are poisoning this generation. You will destroy the future of our country. Repent before it is too late." The preacher had underlined the word "destroy" 3 times, as though trying to carve it into the young singer's conscience. Elvis read it alone in his room, the lamp burning low, and for a moment he felt a pang of doubt. Could a song really ruin a country? Could rhythm carry that much power? He thought of his own mother, how she still worried about the criticism, how she prayed nightly that the world would see her boy for the gentle soul she knew. The very next day, another letter arrived, and it cut through the gloom like a spotlight. This one was from a soldier recently returned from Korea. The handwriting was rough, the grammar uneven, but the sincerity undeniable. "Your music kept me alive," it read. "I had a little record player at the base. When the nights were long, and I thought I wouldn't make it, I put on your songs. They reminded me of home, of things worth coming back to. You don't know me, but I owe you my life." Elvis folded the page carefully, as though it might tear if handled too roughly. In that moment, the words of the preacher shrank into insignificance. He realized his songs were not only shaking hips. They were carrying men through battlefields, reaching the lonely, the wounded, the forgotten. Yet outside his private reflections, the war of opinion only escalated. In some cities, officials bowed to pressure from conservative groups and banned his concerts outright. Promoters canceled contracts, citing community standards. Posters advertising shows were torn down overnight. Parents cheered these victories as though they were protecting their children from plague. But elsewhere, where no ban existed, the opposite occurred. Tickets disappeared within hours. Venues overflowed with crowds so large that fire marshals panicked. Scalpers charged triple the price, and teenagers willingly paid. The bans, rather than killing the demand, had only sharpened it. Every restriction turned the name Elvis into a whispered rebellion, something dangerous and irresistible. On one tour stop, As he stepped onto a stage packed with police officers standing shoulder to shoulder, Elvis noticed teenagers holding homemade signs. They weren't the usual "We love you" posters. These read, "They can't stop us," "Rock on, Elvis," and one girl had scrawled in lipstick across a bedsheet, "Our parents hate you. That's why we're here." The sight made him laugh mid-song, a deep belly laugh that confused the policemen and thrilled the kids. He felt, in that instant, that he wasn't just entertaining anymore. He was leading an unspoken movement. Still, the letters kept pouring in, dark and light interwoven. At night, he sometimes laid them across the bedspread. On the left, curses and condemnations. On the right, thank yous and confessions of love. Looking at them side by side, he saw the outline of America itself, split, angry, hopeful, afraid. He began to understand something crucial. The critics thought they were fighting a boy with a guitar, but the truth was more complicated. His songs had become symbols, weapons even, in a cultural struggle much bigger than himself. The real battle was between generations, between fear and desire, between silence and expression. One evening, riding the bus after a concert, Elvis pulled out the soldier's letter again. The lights of the city blurred past the windows, neon signs flickering against the glass. He whispered the words to himself, "You don't know me, but I owe you my life." He realized that this was his answer to the preacher, to the judge, to every protester who waved a placard outside his concerts. If music could keep a man alive in the mud of Korea, then no law, no sermon, no ban could convince him it was evil. And so, with every mile traveled and every stage conquered, Elvis carried the contradiction in his chest like a secret fire. Hated and adored, condemned and worshipped, one man standing at the fault line of a nation trying to decide what it wanted to become. By 1970, the boy who once terrified judges and preachers had become something stranger, a man caught between myth and exhaustion. Elvis Presley was no longer just a singer with a guitar. He was an icon dressed in rhinestones, headlining Las Vegas residencies, adored and yet oddly restless. Beneath the spotlight's glare, he carried a gnawing hunger not for applause, but for validation of a different kind. The newspapers spoke endlessly about drugs invading America's youth. Heroin in cities, LSD in suburbs, pills slipping into schools. Ironically, Elvis himself was wrestling with the fog of prescription medications that blurred his nights. But in his mind, he believed he could be a counterweight, a figure who could prove to America that he was not the corrupter, but the protector of its young. That winter, in a burst of impulse, he picked up a notepad aboard a commercial flight and scribbled a letter in his sweeping hand. It was addressed to President Richard Nixon. The tone was earnest, almost pleading. "I would love to meet with you to discuss how I might be of service to the country. I believe I could be of help in your crusade against drugs. I would like to be granted a federal badge." The words might have sounded absurd to some, but to Elvis, they were deeply serious. Since boyhood, he had collected police insignia, flashing them with the same pride others reserved for medals. To him, a badge was not a toy. It was proof that he could be trusted, respected, even sanctified in the eyes of authority. The letter, hand-delivered to the White House by his entourage, landed on the desk of Nixon's aides with the force of a curiosity bomb. The president himself, a man perpetually anxious about his public image, saw opportunity. If he could align himself with Presley, the most famous entertainer in America, he could reach millions of young people in ways speeches never could. And so, to the surprise of nearly everyone, the meeting was arranged. December 21st, 1970. The White House, late morning. Elvis arrived not in a sober suit, but in a flamboyant purple velvet outfit with a cape-like coat, a wide belt adorned with a massive gold buckle, and sunglasses that glinted beneath the winter sun. Secret Service agents eyed him warily as he stepped through the gates, but they could not deny his charm. He carried a gift for the president, a Colt .45 pistol encased in a walnut box, polished to a gleam. Inside the Oval Office, Nixon waited stiffly, dark suit pressed, jaw tight as ever. The two men could not have been more different. One, the embodiment of political calculation, the other, a creature of impulse and spectacle. Yet when Elvis entered, he bowed slightly and extended his hand with boyish eagerness. "Mr. President," he said softly, "it's an honor." Nixon, awkward but intrigued, accepted the gun with a small nod. "Well, thank you. I suppose we'll keep this one locked up," he muttered. The staff chuckled nervously. Then came the conversation. Elvis spoke rapidly, passionately, about the dangers of drugs, about how music could either uplift or destroy, about his desire to serve his country beyond the stage. He leaned forward, eyes wide with sincerity, and asked Nixon for what he wanted most: a badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. For a moment, silence hung heavy. It was an unusual request, almost laughable in its audacity. Yet Nixon, ever conscious of image, saw the political gold shimmering beneath. To grant Presley a badge would cost him nothing, and buy him the allegiance of millions of fans. So he smiled thinly, reached into his desk, and produced an official credential. He handed it across the desk to Elvis Presley, who accepted it as though receiving a holy relic. The king of rock and roll held it in his palm, eyes shining with childlike wonder. "Thank you, sir," he whispered. "You'll never regret this." The meeting, brief yet surreal, was photographed by White House staff. The image would later become one of the most requested in the National Archives. Nixon stiff and formal, Presley radiant in velvet, two worlds colliding in a handshake that neither had fully planned. For Elvis, it was a vindication. The boy once branded indecent by judges and pastors now stood endorsed by the highest office in the land. The badge in his pocket felt like armor, proof that he was more than the gyrations, more than the scandals. He was a man recognized by authority, an ally of law, a patriot in rhinestones. Yet beneath the triumph lay irony. Those who once despised him as immoral now saw him embraced by a president, while those who had worshipped his rebellion squirmed at the sight of him aligning with politics. For Elvis himself, the truth was simpler. He had craved acceptance, and for one shining afternoon in Washington, he believed he had found it. When he left the White House, walking past the colonnades with the winter air sharp in his lungs, he clutched the badge like a boy holding a treasure from a dream. Outside the gates, tourists gasped and shouted his name, never guessing what had just transpired inside. In that surreal collision of power and spectacle, one chapter closed and another opened. Elvis Presley, once threatened with arrest for indecency, now carried the emblem of federal authority in his pocket. And though history would later treat the moment with irony, for Elvis it was no joke. It was the proof he had sought his whole life, that he was not merely tolerated, but trusted by the country that had once tried to silence him. Las Vegas, early 1970s. The Hilton International Hotel gleamed like a palace in the desert night, its marquee blazing with Presley's name in letters taller than a man. Inside, the main showroom had been transformed into something closer to a cathedral of sound. An orchestra of strings and horns waiting behind a curtain. A sea of tables glinting with champagne glasses, sequins, and diamonds under the glow of chandeliers. It was not the same America as 1956. The teenagers who had once sneaked out to see him were now adults, with children of their own. Yet the hunger remained. Crowds flew in from Chicago, Dallas, even Europe, to watch the king rise again in glittering jumpsuits embroidered with jewels that caught every ray of light. On this particular night, the anticipation was feverish. The room swelled with chatter until the lights dimmed, and a hush rippled like a wave. The orchestra struck its first thunderous chord, and then there he was. Elvis strode into the spotlight, cape flowing, white suit dazzling with studs. The applause was volcanic, shaking glasses on tables. He launched into song, his voice as powerful as ever, weaving through the room like a force of nature. But even as the music soared, something in the crowd shifted. At a table near the center, a cluster of young activists suddenly stood, holding cardboard signs scrawled in black marker, "Elvis the Menace." "You destroyed a generation. Truth, not glitter." The room froze. For a moment, the only sound was the echo of the orchestra trailing off, uncertain. Waiters halted mid-step. Guests craned their necks. The activists raised their voices, chanting accusations that sliced through the velvet air. Elvis stopped. He lowered his microphone, tilting his head as if listening more closely. His band, sensing his cue, fell silent. The sudden stillness was electric. The entire audience held its breath. The spotlight glared hot on his face, but his expression was unreadable. No anger, no panic, only calm. He could have ignored them, let security rush forward, turned the moment into another forgettable disturbance. But something inside him resisted that easy exit. This wasn't just heckling. It was the echo of every sermon, every editorial, every condemnation he had ever faced. The courtroom in Jacksonville, the signs outside radio stations, the letters dripping with judgment. All of it stood before him again, wearing fresh ink on cardboard. Slowly, deliberately, he raised the microphone back to his lips. His voice, when it came, was steady and clear, carrying across the room without strain. "If loving music is a crime," he said, pausing long enough for silence to deepen, "then I suppose I'm guilty." The words were not shouted. They weren't defiant in tone. They were delivered with a kind of gentle gravity, as though he were confessing a truth rather than sparring with enemies. For a heartbeat, the room stayed hushed. Then the explosion came. Applause, cheers, whistles, an eruption so fierce it swallowed the activists' chants. Guests leapt to their feet, pounding the tables, drowning out the protest with a tidal wave of approval. The activists faltered, their signs trembling in their hands, voices lost in the storm of devotion that thundered through the hall. The orchestra picked up again, swelling into triumphant chords. Elvis smiled, not smugly, but with a trace of warmth, as though relieved that humor and dignity had won where rage might have failed. He resumed the song, his voice soaring above the chaos, and the energy in the room doubled. Every lyric felt charged now, infused with the memory of what had just unfolded. By the time the show ended, the protesters had been escorted out quietly, their departure unnoticed amid the ovations. Fans pressed forward, desperate to touch his hand, to claim a scrap of the moment for themselves. Backstage, his band buzzed with excitement, retelling the scene as though it were already legend. "You froze 'em, man," one guitarist said, "like Moses parting the Red Sea." Another laughed. "Never seen anything like it." You didn't even raise your voice, but Elvis, towel draped around his shoulders, sank into a chair with a weary smile. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by reflection. He had learned long ago that shouting back only fed the fire. Tonight, he had chosen something different. By turning accusation into a quiet truth, he had transformed the battlefield into a lesson. He thought again of the letter from the Mississippi mother, the words of the soldier from Korea, the faces of fans who still lined up outside his gates in Memphis. They were why he sang. Not the critics, not the headlines, not even the glittering lights of Las Vegas. And yet, in the quiet of that dressing room, he also felt the faint sting of irony. For years, they had tried to silence him because of his hips, his movements, his noise. Now, he had silenced his enemies with nothing more than a calm sentence. When he walked back into the night, neon signs blazing across the desert sky, the city seemed to hum with a deeper kind of victory. The stage had been a battlefield, but he had walked off not as a conqueror with spoils, nor as a martyr wounded by criticism. He had walked off as something rarer, a man who turned judgment into applause without ever raising his fist. And in Las Vegas, a city that thrived on spectacle, that quiet triumph echoed louder than the loudest song. Memphis, mid-1970s. The city where Elvis had once been a shy truck driver now welcomed him back as a monarch. Billboards bore his name, hotels overflowed, and the streets around Graceland swarmed with fans hoping for a glimpse of their idol. Yet, on one particular evening at the Mid-South Coliseum, amid the thousands who filled the arena, a single face carried a weight far heavier than the rest. Judge Marion Gooding. The very man who, 2 decades earlier, had stood in a Jacksonville courthouse and branded Elvis Presley indecent, now sat among the crowd. Older, heavier, his once black hair turned gray. Time had dulled his authority, but not his pride. Few in the arena recognized him. History had moved on, but for Elvis, the news that Gooding was in attendance struck like a chord from the past. Backstage before the show, the rumor reached him. One of the crew whispered, almost nervously, "The judge who tried to stop you. He's out there tonight." Elvis paused. He was already dressed in his white jumpsuit, trimmed with red stones, cape hanging from his shoulders, microphone resting in his hand. The announcement pulled him backward through time. 1956. The courthouse, the threat of arrest, the humiliation that could have ended everything. He had carried that memory like a scar. And now the man responsible sat waiting beyond the curtain. The concert began as usual, with thunder from the orchestra and a roar from the crowd. Elvis strode into the spotlight, voice booming across the arena, every song rolling over the audience like a tide. But beneath the rhythm and cheers, he felt the presence of that single man, silent in his seat, watching. Midway through the set, after finishing a ballad that left the crowd in hushed awe, Elvis let the music fade. He stood still for a moment, scanning the faces before him. He never pointed, never named names. Instead, he began to speak, his tone measured, soft enough that the vast room leaned forward to catch his words. "There was a time," he said, "when somebody told me I wasn't worth a thing, said my singing was shameful, said the way I moved was an insult to this country." His voice grew steadier, the memories shaping every syllable. "Back then, I thought maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't belong. But the truth is, every one of us has to decide for ourselves who we are. No one else gets to make that choice for you." The crowd erupted with cheers, applause rolling like thunder. Elvis held up his hand, quieting them, his gaze still sweeping across the sea of faces. "And I'll tell you something else," he continued. "I thank that man. Because without him, I might never have learned how strong I could be. The ovation that followed was deafening. Fans stood, clapping, shouting his name. The orchestra swelled behind him, but for a moment the music was drowned out by human voices, adoring, affirming, unshakable. Somewhere in the middle rows, Judge Gooding sat stiff in his chair, hands folded in his lap. Those around him likely had no idea who he was or that the words had been meant for him. He did not clap. He did not smile. He simply stared, his face pale beneath the arena lights. The power he once held over this man had evaporated. The world remembered Elvis. The world had forgotten him. Elvis turned back to the microphone, launching into the next song with renewed force. His voice soared higher, richer, as though a weight had finally lifted. He no longer sang as a man haunted by a past humiliation. He sang as someone who had turned the wound into fuel, the insult into a crown. Backstage after the show, the conversation hummed with speculation. "Did you see him?" one of the musicians whispered. "The judge was right there." Another nodded, eyes wide. "You didn't even call him out." "You could have crushed him." Elvis only shrugged, sipping from a glass of water. His face was calm, almost serene. "No need," he said quietly. The music did the talking. And perhaps that was the deepest irony of all. Gooding had once stood as the embodiment of authority, a man with the power to end Presley's career before it began. Now he was just an old figure in the audience, anonymous, unmoved, his presence significant only because Elvis chose to transform it into something larger. Not revenge, but grace. For the fans leaving the Coliseum that night, the moment became legend. They spoke of how Elvis had paused mid-show, how he had told a story about being told he was worthless, and how he had thanked his critic instead of spitting back fire. To them, it wasn't just music. It was a parable of strength, a reminder that dignity can rise where bitterness might have stood. As the crowd drifted into the Memphis night, their voices echoed the lesson. Humiliation could be turned into triumph, insult into art. And somewhere in the darkness, the judge walked away unremarked, a ghost of an older America, while the king remained, his throne built not from vengeance, but from mercy. The summer of 1977 ended in shock. News bulletins crackled across radios and televisions. Elvis Presley had died in Memphis at just 42. Crowds gathered outside Graceland, clutching flowers, photographs, and candles. For days, the gates became a river of grief, thousands passing in silence, whispering prayers, wiping tears. But even as the nation mourned, stories resurfaced, not only of the jumpsuits, the Vegas shows, or the hit records. Reporters reached further back, to the boy who once stood accused of indecency in a Jacksonville courtroom. The episode that Judge Marion Gooding had hoped would bury Presley instead re-emerged as one of the defining myths of his rise. Articles framed it as the moment a generation realized their idol would not bow. Historians later wrote that the courtroom warning and the police threat at the Florida Theater marked the birth of Elvis the Rebel, an image that clung to him for the rest of his life. Without that confrontation, they argued, he might have remained just another Southern singer with a handful of hits. With it, he became a symbol of defiance. In living rooms across America, fans shared their own memories. One woman, now in her 40s, told a reporter that she had been a teenager in the balcony that night in Jacksonville. "When he lifted his finger instead of his hips," she said, laughing through tears, "we knew he was laughing at the whole system. And for the first time in my life, I thought, maybe I don't have to do everything they tell me." A man who had been a boy then remembered how his father stormed out in disgust while he stayed. spellbound. That was the night I realized music wasn't just noise. It was freedom. He taught me that such testimonies filled the airwaves. They revealed something extraordinary. What had once been called scandal was now remembered as inspiration. What was framed as indecency became a parable of courage. Judge Gooding's name barely surfaced. When it did, it was often as a footnote, a shadow figure in the story of a star's ascent. No one quoted his warnings about morality. No one carried placards praising his caution. Time had erased him from memory, leaving only the man he had tried to silence. At Graceland, as the procession passed, a group of young fans, too young to have seen Elvis in the 1950s, held up signs that read, "We will always remember the King." For them, the tale of the judge and the threatened arrest was not history, but legend, retold like a fable passed down by older siblings and parents. They knew the details secondhand, but the moral was clear. Elvis had faced down authority with humor and walked away stronger. In the years that followed, documentaries and biographies returned again and again to that summer of 1956. Footage of the Jacksonville concert, though grainy and incomplete, was shown with reverence. Writers called it "The Night Innocence Met Rebellion," the first shot in the Cultural Revolution, the courtroom that made a king. And always, the story ended not with the judge's decree, but with the boy's grin, the sly wag of his finger, the roar of the crowd. For the fans who carried his memory, the lesson lingered. Life, they said, was full of people telling you who you couldn't be, what you shouldn't do. Elvis showed them another path, not through violence, not through rage, but through daring to be himself when the whole world demanded otherwise. One woman, interviewed decades later, put it simply, "When I saw Elvis on that stage, teasing those policemen without fear, I decided I would never let anyone else write my story. That's the gift he gave us. That's why we still talk about him." And so the tale of humiliation became the tale of triumph. A courtroom threat turned into the cornerstone of a legend. A moment designed to silence a singer instead gave birth to a symbol that outlived both his critics and his own brief life. Today, visitors still stream to Graceland, standing at his grave in quiet reflection. Some leave flowers, some leave handwritten notes. Among them, occasionally, someone leaves a clipping from an old newspaper. Judge threatens Elvis with arrest, folded neatly, as if to remind the world of where the legend began. The irony is eternal. The name of the judge is forgotten, his authority dissolved. But the young man he tried to shame still sings through jukeboxes, car radios, headphones, stages, and memories. His voice, once called indecent, now feels timeless. And perhaps that is the truest ending. Not the courtroom, not the threats, not even the badge from a president, but the transformation of insult into immortality. For in the end, Elvis Presley's greatest performance was not a song at all. It was the way he turned an attempt to break him into the moment that made him unforgettable.